the God's strategy, the God's strategies, the God's covert strategy, the God's covert strategies, the God's overt strategy, the God's overt strategies, the God's indirect strategy, the God's indirect strategies, the God's direct strategy, the God's direct strategies, the God's soft strategy, the God's soft strategies, the God's firm strategy, the God's firm strategies, the God's hard strategy, the God's hard strategies, the God's beginning strategy, the God's beginning strategies, the God's middling strategy, the God's middling strategies, the God's ending strategy, the God's ending strategies, the God's private strategy, the God's private strategies, the God's public strategy, the God's public strategies, the God's silent strategy, the God's silent strategies, the God's written strategy, the God's written strategies, the God's photo strategy, the God's photo strategies, the God's audio strategy, the God's audio strategies, the God's video strategy, the God's video strategies, the God's past strategy, the God's past strategies, the God's present strategy, the God's present strategies, the God's future strategy, the God's future strategies,